Hello everyone, my name is Vincent Bova, Dealer Experience Manager at RTI. Welcome to our weekly webinar on tags and macro levels. Very important subject in terms of Integration Designer Apex because tags and macro levels are two of the biggest major driving points in Apex. They do require some practice and some going over the concepts and getting used to them. But once you're able to learn these concepts, this is what makes Apex super efficient and really the reason why we developed Apex. And why did we develop Apex? Well, one of the reasons why we developed Apex, in addition to trying to keep up with the market demands and everything else, is that we really want to address all of the tedious things that were present in our old software platform. All the things that were difficult to do, or all the things that required a lot of work, or were a little bit daunting, or a little bit repetitive, we tried to get rid of and addressing that in our new software. So tags and macro levels, in addition to being a great feature on their own, are really ways that we've adopted that make programming a lot quicker and efficient. So let's begin with tags, because tags and macro levels are really tied together. They kind of work in tandem. Without macro levels, tags wouldn't have a lot of functionality, and without tags, macro levels would be useless also. Now, what tags are? Let's define tags in Apex. Tags are a logical naming convention that you assign to a button or feedback that's basically reserved for a macro or variable. And these macro and variables have different levels which we'll go over, but let's stay on tags. So when we create a user interface in Apex, so I'm looking at a system file here, and we have several different layouts. We have an RTI panel in 7 different rooms, and so I'm going to be using this as an example file. But when we auto program Apex, or when we create a user interface by adding a device, it will automatically program all of our buttons. And if you click on each button, you'll see that it has a corresponding command in the lower macro window. So these buttons are, for the most part, auto-programmed in Apex. But how does that happen? Let's take a step back and think about how Apex works behind the scenes. I'm going to go to our page wizard here, and I'm going to show you all the different page sets that we have in Apex. So if I look at my AM/FM radio for my iPad, or the cable satellite interface, or a DVD interface, or a climate interface, all of these interfaces are interfaces that we've created for you in a stock template format. But not only did we create this user interface for you that are generic in nature, so what that means is if you add a DVD player or a Blu-ray player to Apex, we're going to give you one single layout, no matter what device you add. So whether you add a Samsung manufactured Blu-ray, or a Sony manufactured Blu-ray, or any other manufacturer, you're going to have the same layout, okay? So this layout was developed inside RTI so that we can auto-program these buttons for you, at least from the onset, allowing you to change things later on, of course. But we wanted to program most of the buttons for you so you had a decent amount of work already done for you. Even hard buttons, which were tedious in older platforms where you had to drag and drop every command. Anyway, when we develop these graphical layouts, we also assign tags to each button that you see here for the Blu-ray. So again, no matter what Blu-ray you add, whether it's a Sony Blu-ray, Samsung Blu-ray, or any other DVD or Blu-ray, it's going to look the same as you see here. It's going to have the same tags, And the tags are going to take the IR library or driver library or serial library or anything you're adding, and they're going to try and correlate the name of the tag to the command in the library. Let's take a step back now and look at this interface, which is polished, a little bit polished up by us. So this is not what it looks like out of the box, but it's fairly close. If we click on any button that you see here, such as the play button, you'll see the command in the macro window play. But you'll also see in the tag window the name of the tag. So every button you click, you will see the tag name of that button in the lower section of the window under the tag window. You can also hover over icons or bitmaps or feedback for the most part, as long as there's a check mark, which means it's programmed and tagged. And you'll see the tag name and what type of macro is on that button. Let's stay on tags and not worry about macros right now. So we can see that this green button has a tag called green. That's why tags are logical. We have a logical naming scheme that we developed. So there is a document that's available that shows you this logical naming scheme that we assign. This is our technical bulletin on all of the different tags that we have that are standard tags that we can use to auto-populate corresponding functions in driver libraries or IR libraries when you add a device. So for example, this power off is the official tag for any power off command. And you can see here that it's important that the tag is named exactly the way it appears here. Okay? If it's not named exactly as it appeared here, notice tags usually start with a capital letter. And if there's a second word, that starts with a capital letter also. And if there's a third word, that starts with a capital letter also. So they're all pretty much logical in nature and they're consistent. But what they map to is really what another step we went and made. We made a little bit of a cross-reference table that looks at all the various forms of IR codes and driver codes that come in so that we can map these power-ons to several different versions of the command. So you can see here the power-on command will map to power-on and on in that case. And as you go through here, the tags are laid out with the logical name and the description on what they'll actually map to in these libraries. Now, it's important to know that this tag mapping scheme we developed is categorized by the type of product. So, for example, we have a whole selection here of tags for HVAC controllers. You're going to see tag names that are consistent with an HVAC unit. Stat cool will connect to a cool command or a mode cool. So now you know how to map these things so that when you create a generic interface, maybe even your own, you kind of know what to tag things if you wanted to map to something. Now, it's important to know that not every single command here is captured. So the reason why we kind of do these tags is to give you a little bit of a head start. We try to cover all the important tags, and as we go through this, you'll see how logical it is. You know, the 0, what does it mean? It means the number 0. So we try to really keep it simple. We don't use tag names that are illogical or don't make sense. They all are reference points to the actual command. You don't see any ID 7021 or anything like that. These are logical names. So if you follow the naming convention with the capital letters in the beginning, you'll pretty much connect to a lot of the devices and commands that are in the libraries. Now, it's important to remember that not every command functionality is here. So for example, in our Blu-ray example, most of these commands were automatically programmed. But let's take our Netflix command. Our Netflix command doesn't have an official tag called Netflix, at least not yet. And it should be known that we keep adding tags to our database of tags, but we haven't added Netflix yet. So in order to facilitate tags that won't map to buttons automatically, we give you the ability to use your own tag names. So over here, you'll see that I gave this its own tag of Netflix, and I programmed a Netflix button, command on it. So not every tag will connect automatically. Okay, so very important to know that when you create a tag name, to follow the same type of naming convention. Make sure it matches the function. Don't call a tag ABC123 or a pet's name when it's a command indeed that can be described logically. And that's how tags work. So they'll connect to a command in the library. So let's see how this works. We add a DVD player. The page wizard automatically will create a Blu-ray page that looks just like this, that has tags on it that are logical. What it will do then will take the tags on these buttons and try to connect them to the tag name that is in our cross-reference table. So for example, we have a button called menu. There is a tag called menu on that button. And it will map to a series of commands with our cross-reference table in the library. It might map to a command in the library called menu or menu main or main menu, depending on what the cross-reference table that's internal to Apex says to do. So as you can see, tags have a main function that makes it easy to auto-program buttons. Now, it's important to know that not every tag that we have is here on this interface. So in other words, there could be a series of tags for a DVD Blu-ray player that are standard, but since we only represent a small portion of it in our generic layout, not every tag that we have will correlate to every command in the library because we don't have every button on the interface, nor do we want to have every button. Remember, we want to keep our interfaces simple. So what that really means is that there could be buttons that there are tags for that are not represented in this interface. So for example, if I want to, let's create a button here. Let's bring in a button and let's give this a tag of, in the tag window, let's tag it power. Notice that as I tag this power, it'll automatically populate this in our macro window because this power button, and I'll just change this text so we know what it does, this power button now has been mapped. And now this tag power actually exists in our interface. It's important to know that a tag doesn't officially exist in Apex until it's placed on a button. Okay, so when we add devices to Apex, it will create a pre-tagged interface and will map those tags to the logical name in the IR or driver library. So auto-programming, huge feature of Apex. Okay, so now that we auto-program, we take away some of the more tedious tasks. And what's great about this is we don't have to drag and drop stuff. And if we want to create a layout, we don't have to worry. We just tag it and the command will populate if it's in the cross-reference table. Now, what about tags that you want to create on your own, like custom tags? And that's possible too. So if I drag a button in here, maybe there's no play pause button that toggles on this Blu-ray player, but maybe I want to create my own button. I'll go down here and I'll create a tag that's logical. I'll call it play pause. And notice I'm capitalizing both letters in those words. That just follows the general pattern that we use so to keep things a little bit more organized. Then I'll go to my macro steps here now that my button has been tagged, and I'll look for my Blu-ray library in this list of all the devices that are available to me. I'll select the Blu-ray player, and now I'll bring in a pause and play command. And maybe I'll also bring in another macro step here. Lost my command. I'll bring in a macro step here that will toggle this IR code for me. So it will, you press it once, it will play. You press it again, it will pause. Now I have a button that will basically play and pause for me, and I'll just create a little bit of an icon to show somebody what this actually does. Okay, so that's our play pause button. Now, you know, when someone looks at this, they're going to say, "Wow, that's fine and good, but wouldn't it just be easy to just not have to tag that button and then just put the play pause in and you're done? And why do you have to go through that extra step?" And that's where the second main feature of tags really, really hits. Tags are also responsible for driving macro and variables, which have different levels. What do the levels mean, and why do we do this? Do we do this to complicate people's lives or make our programming more difficult? Actually, it's to the contrary. We make it so that it's more powerful and further reaching. So, for example, one of the main challenges of ID9 was you would have to create commands in many different places. And if you had to change that command, or if there was a problem with that command, or if there was a mistake, or if there was some other type of problem or addition or subtraction, you'd have to change it in every single place where you made that change. So for example, if I gave the client a button that does something like arm the home or arm the security all over the interfaces on several remotes, on several pages, all over my project file, and then he wants to make a change to that button, or there's a problem with it, assuming it wasn't a system macro or something, you would have to go and find that button and make that change in every single location. So in order to get around that, and what Apex does is that since every button has a little identifier called a tag, we could use those names to drive changes or any kind of modification or any kind of anything in terms of maintenance. So what if the client asked for this button here, but he also wants it on his T3X remote, which is controlling the same device? And what if he had other controllers? Let's go to our T3X interface. What if he wanted this button, which already has a tag, but we could just erase this? It won't erase the tag. It'll just allow us to put another tag in. All I have to do is type in the play pause tag I did on that device, on that other source, and that will actually drive my command in here. And then all I need to do is make it modify it to do the command to show what command it is. So as you can see here, I didn't have to program that again. Okay? And it works the same with variables as well. What if I have a variable that I want to program? For example, in this room, there's a receiver. There's a Yamaha receiver. And maybe I want to show a volume gauge on my iPad. So here's a slider, but let's do a gauge. I'm going to draw a gauge here, okay? So I'm going to draw this gauge, and this is going to reflect the current volume in this room. Okay, I'm going to put a tag on this because you can't put a every device or every button or every feedback element needs a tag. You'll see why in a minute, but I have to tag this. I'll call it volume gauge. Okay, and now I'll put a variable on this volume gauge. I'll put a value on it that will give me the volume level of my Yamaha receiver. Okay? But now my customer wants this on other interfaces in this system file. Obviously in this room, because Apex is room-based. So how can I drive this functionality to another part of the user interface without having to reprogram it? Better yet, what if I wanted to use a different type of gauge? Let's see how this works. Maybe the gauge doesn't have to be on my Blu-ray player in this room. Maybe I want it on my Apple TV, on another controller. So he wants to see the gauge here in this window here. I'll just move this over. But this is a whole different device. I'll go to my bitmaps. I'll look for a gauge that I could use, and I won't even use a horizontal gauge. I'll use a vertical gauge. I'll find one that matches the size of my interface for now. But all I have to do here is, instead of having to reprogram this, I could type in volume gauge. As long as it matches that tag I did for that last device, and notice that it populates here, even though it's a completely separate device in that room, and it's a completely different graphical element. The other one was a drawn. I drew an actual gauge with my iPad, and now let's look at our iPad gauge. And on the other screen, on my Apple TV, on my other remote, I placed a horizontal gauge. But because the tag names were the same, I were able to drive that functionality without having to reprogram it. So that's fine and good. That means that tags, when you make a change to a tag name, it will make that change everywhere. Or does it make it everywhere? Maybe I don't want to make that change to every tag called volume gauge. For example, let's look at our play button for our Blu-ray player. Let's go back to our Blu-ray player. And now let's look at our play button. And let's look at the macro that's on this button. Okay, it's a Blu-ray play command. Now, what if the client wants to do something else to this play command? What if he wants to make it do something different? Maybe he wants to send a clear command or an exit command or a cancel command after the play. Just as an example. Once I make the change here, because this has a play tag, it will make the same change on this device here. But play is a common tag, and I might have play on other devices. What about my cable box? I have a play button. There's a play tag. It's the same. It's the same tag name, but there's a different command here. So how do I determine how to change these names and how to define functionality? Well, that's what macro and variable levels are for. So there's 4 types of macro and variable levels. We'll focus more in on macros because it's the same concept, just whether it's a macro or variable. The 4 types of macros and variable levels are global, source, room, and controller. And I'll tell you off the bat that it's possible to have more than one of these levels on a single button or feedback. They have priorities, and the one that has the highest priority will always trump the rest. So for example, If I have a global macro and a source macro and a room macro on a button, the room macro, which has a higher priority than the other two, will basically execute and the other two would be ignored. And what if I put on that same button that has a global macro, a source macro, and a room macro, I placed a controller macro? Well, that controller macro will trump the other three. Now, before you get discouraged and say, wow, this is way too complicated, let's take a look at why we do this. When I made this change to my play command on my Blu-ray player, let's go back to our Blu-ray player and let's look at this play command that we made a change to. Right now, this play command has a source macro on it. How do I know that? There's two ways to know. The first way to know is that this little icon down in the macro window will indicate a source macro because there'll be a purple ring around the macro level or the highest macro level on that button. And you'll see here in our new button properties window that there's the same ring around that macro, and I'm selecting it and you'll see the macro on that button. If I click on global, there's nothing. If I click on room or controller, there's no other macro levels on this button. There's just a source macro. So what is a source macro? A source macro is basically a macro that will run on the source level. So how does that work? It means that the tag on that button is will basically drive any change we make to it or any addition or subtraction for that source in that room on every single controller. So when we made a change to that play command, it basically said, okay, he's making a change to this source macro. The tag is play. I'm going to make that change on this source in this room only on every controller. That's why we're able to change the command here and not the other play commands in this room on other devices. We didn't affect the cable box or the Apple TV's play command. We only affected the Samsung's play command. Now, if you have several remotes in this system, you could see why this would be a huge advantage. What if there were other remotes in this room? For example, what if the client had, and I'll add the remotes to the room to give you an example. What if the client had an iPhone in this living room? We'll add an iPhone. And he had an iPhone his. We'll add this. And let's add another one. Maybe he had an iPhone hers. They're all going to control the same device. Now let's look at our Blu-ray player, and we're going to click on our Blu-ray player in the tree, and we're going to see now that there's an interface for the existing global controller, the iPad, the T3X, and the his and hers, auto-programmed, okay? But if you click on the play command for any of these his and hers, because that tag was inherited and it's on a source level, you'll see that that change we made is now existing on controllers we just added that weren't even around when we made the change in the first place. This tag combined with the macro level is driving a change on a certain part of the interface, being the source part. Now, if we look at other source devices in this room, like our Apple TV, and we look at the play command there, they have their own separate source macros, okay? No matter what device you select, even the iPhones will have the source macro with the Apple TV command. But the problem is that there's 4 of them. There's 4 play commands, right? Even our DVD Blu-ray player has 4 different play commands. There's one here, there's one on the T3X, there's one on the Blu-ray, and there's one on the iPhone his and the iPhone hers. What if the client And I'll just, now what if I remove this cancel button? I'll affect every single one. It's a source level. It will affect that source in that room on all controllers if it's a source macro. All right. So this is a concept you kind of have to get used to on the macro level. Why did I start with source? Because they're the most common. Typically, when you add a device to Apex, like a Blu-ray or an Apple TV or any kind of device, typically the macros you program that on those buttons are going to be source macros. Why? Because if you change anything, like a command or add a command, you wanted to change that tag, that you wanted to take that tag on that button and apply that change on that source in that room only on all controllers. So if you have another Blu-ray in another room, it won't affect it. It's only going to affect this source in this room on every controller. Okay, well, here's where it'll really start making sense. Let's take this another level. What if a client, we have these 4 remotes controlling this same exact device, and now the client asks us to make a pretty big change. He wants us to create a lighting scene on every single play, stop, and pause command on his Blu-ray player, so that when he hits play, maybe the lights turn on, or if he hits pause, maybe the lights turn, if he hits play, the lights turn off, and if he hits pause, the lights turn on, or stop, the lights turn on. Well, you have to do that basically 4 times 3. You have to make 12 changes. But with source macros, you could do it. You could pick any play, stop, and pause button. Since it's on a source level, this macro, I could go to my macro steps here on my play button, look for my Lutron cassetter dimmers, and I could bring in my dimmer command here, and I can raise this. I could put the living room ceiling device. I could either, we'll use a dimmer level. I could set a dimmer level here or a scene to a certain level. So maybe when he hits play, we only want the lights on a 5 level. Okay, and we'll make that for our living room. Okay, but on our pause button, all right, he wants to basically, he wants to set this level to maybe 75%. Okay, and then on the stop, he wants to set it to the same thing also, maybe 75%. Or maybe even higher. Let's say 90. I can even go and change the fade level so when he hits play, that it takes a little bit of time for it to fade down. So to give him a little bit of a better effect. That's the fade, that's the delay time. Now I'd have to go and do this on the rest of my controllers. But because the macro is on a source level, these buttons will already be programmed for me. So I'm allowed, with the source macro, for a given tag, to change that button, and I'll show you a little chart here. If the tag is common and it has a source macro, it'll take that tag and apply it to that single source in that single room on all the controllers. Source macro. It's the second lowest priority. Okay, and the priorities as I'm going down here go up. So the global macro would be the lowest priority. And let's talk about that next. Why did I start with the source macro? Because they're the most common. Every time you create an interface, Apex will program it with the source macros for the most part. Now, why do we have other macro levels? And what's the point of putting higher levels so that I can program more than one macro level on a button? Am I ever going to want a higher level macro on this button? Well, I could if I want to drive this change even further. For example, what if I took this menu command? Okay, and every device has its own menu command. So you'll see here this menu main has a source macro, and the tag is called menu. And you'll see that every device here will have a menu button with the same button name, the same command, and the same tag. Okay? No matter what device I select. So I know I know if I make a change to this menu button, it'll affect this source, the Blu-ray player, in this room, the living room, on all the controllers, the RTI panel, the T3X, and the 2 iPhones. I know that already. I know what a source macro is. But what if I wanted to make that affect that change even further? I wanted to affect that menu tag on more than just this source in this room on all controllers. So I could take it up a notch. I could affect this change if I want. And let's look at our macro chart and variable chart. I could affect this change on all sources in this single room on every single controller. That's a room macro, okay? Or I could take this menu tag and drive that functionality to all sources on every single room, on every single controller in my entire interface. And why would I ever want to do that? Well, let's look at an example. Let's pretend that I have a button, and I'm going to create a button. Let's look at our bitmaps and search for a button we can use. Let's say the client wants a button that will basically arm his home. Okay? So I'm going to just make a little button on here, and I'm going to stretch it out a little bit. I'm going to call this arm house or whatever you want to call it. It doesn't matter what the physical name of the button is. It's the tag name that matters. And now let's say I try to create a macro on this button. I can't. There's no button properties because there's no tag name. So I have to assign this a tag name. And I'm going to give this a tag name called arm home. I'm going to keep it as short as possible, descriptive as possible, while following the normal naming conventions. Now, as soon as I type in arm home and I hit enter, now I'm entitled to create a macro or a variable or a page link. So what macro level am I going to use? The question is, there's no rule. The question is, how far do I want to drive this tag's functionality? The client says he wants to be able to arm his home from anywhere he is in his house. So I'm guessing it doesn't matter what room he's in, what controller he's using, or what source it's on. So I'm going to create a global macro. That means that it reaches the furthest. That means that wherever this tag appears, it will do the same thing in every room, on every source, on every controller, regardless of anything else. So let's go and create a command on here. Let's make a command here that takes our Honeywell, and we'll do a quick arm here to arm the house. All right, great. What if we copy and paste this to other interfaces? What if I paste it to other sources? I'll put it on my Sonos player, on my RTI panel. I'll put it over here on my music player. And I could scale these pretty easily. The bottom line is, let's put it even in another room. Let's look at my office, which has a CX10. Let's put it on the weather page on my CX10. It doesn't matter where I paste this thing. Of course, the graphic might have to be resized, but the button will do the same exact thing no matter where I paste it. Watch as I paste this anywhere, it will maintain that functionality. What if I even went one other step? What if I went to an interface like my home page and I just tagged this button arm home? It will carry that functionality everywhere for me. I'll just name this arm house. And I can even make a little icon here. And I could take a bitmap here. I think home would be a better choice. And I can just put a little icon here, and I could basically put that to the bottom. And that will arm the house. Now, all right, so big deal. We could copy and paste buttons all over the place in the ID9. So what? The great part about a global macro is that now the client wants to do more than just this command. Now he wants to do other commands too as part of it. And now you're saying, oh boy, I copied that, I put that macro in so many different places. Not only do I have to change them all, I have to find them all. Well, with the global macro level, the best part of it is, so let's just assume here the client wants to do something else. Maybe he wants to close the garage door. I'll go to my relays. I'll take the garage door and I'll use the trigger command, this relay trigger, to close my garage door. Maybe he wants to add a lighting control command too at one point. Maybe he wants to make sure that the goodbye scene is set or something. So I'll actually set that scene here. I'll pick the phantom button that sets the goodbye scene. Okay? Now, what about all the other buttons that have that ARM home tag? Well, let's look at our interface. Let's look at our wherever we created it. Let's look for our Blu-ray player where we put that in the first place. You can see that because it's on the global level, this will auto-populate and change that. But wait a minute, I just made a mistake. I didn't mean scene 7, I meant scene 6. No problem. It'll fix it everywhere. And the best is, it will still allow you to put that command on any button. So let's copy and paste this button. Let's change the tag to ARM home. And that command functionality, as you can see in the macro window, will follow me along. It's a global macro. And a global macro will take that tag and have the same functionality on all sources, in all rooms, on every single controller. Okay, so we know what a global is and we know what a source is. Now, if there is a global macro on a controller, on a button, I mean, and there's a source macro as well, the source macro will overrun it. So it's a bit ironic that the global macro reaches the furthest but has the lowest priority. But you won't use a global macro with a common tag. So chances are you won't clobber anything. You won't get clobbered by a higher level macro. You won't make a play tag a global macro because a play tag would then do the same thing everywhere it appears in that entire interface, in that entire project file for that matter. But a source macro would only be that single source in that single room on all controllers. So what is that? Let's look at some typical tags for global and source. A play command, a 1-digit, a stop command, or a channel macro, or something like that. Those are source macros. And on the flip side, a now playing status, or a status of a cable channel or something. That's a source variable. A global macro would be an ARM home macro or a lock door macro. It's going to do the same thing wherever that tag appears, no matter where we put it. It doesn't make sense to confine it to a room or to a source. It'll do the same thing on all controllers. The same way you would want to see the security status variable. Why would you want your security status variable to be different anywhere? You could make it different everywhere, but if you use a global variable, that variable will carry over wherever that tag appears on all sources in all rooms on every single controller. That's powerful programming. Now let's take it up one level to the room macro. If the source macro is the single source in the single room on every controller, a room macro is all sources in that single room on all controllers. What does that mean? Well, let's look at it. Let's assume in this living room, which I have a bunch of devices, I want something that's going to, a tag, that's going to do something across all sources in this room on every controller, but I don't want it to affect other rooms and sources on their controllers. What's an example of that? Well, a volume command. Let's unlock the top toolbar and look at the volume command for this cable Blu-ray. You could see that this is a room macro. Why is it a room macro? Because I want the tag volume up to do the same thing on this in this entire room on every source. Because every source has a volume up tag, it will do the same thing in this room on every single source, on every single controller. Okay, even my hard button controllers will do the same thing. So if I change this to 5 decibels, I don't have to go and change it on my other controllers as well in this room on every source on every controller. Now, what happens with a room macro? Let's look at a button that might have 2 on it. Here's a button that has a room macro. This volume up has a room macro and a source macro. Let's click on the source macro on this cable box and see what's on it. We have the source level macro on it. So when we added this Scientific Atlanta cable box, it created source macros for all of our buttons here. The channel up button, the list button, the play button, and everything else. And it also had its own volume commands on the cable box. So it created a source macro. But when we added our receiver, and Apex gives you the ability to set that as the room audio source, instead of blowing away the cable box commands, it just creates a higher level macro called the room macro. And the room macro will run over the source macro. That's why you can have more than one macro level on a button. You can decide to push that tag volume up or volume down or mute further than just the source level or the global level. And if I look here, this even has a global macro on it. Not sure why, but it. So as you can see, that is a huge driving change. Now, what about variables? What about our volume gauge? That was a room macro. Even this slider, which has a room variable that will adjust the audio distribution, what if I want to change this to the Yamaha or leave this or whatever? Let's make this the Yamaha audio slider. So let's go and find our Yamaha and we'll set the value and we'll set the command, which you can do in one place in Apex, which is kind of cool. So we'll go to our main and we'll go to our volume set. So now everywhere the word volume appears in this room in that tag, on every source and every controller, it'll do the same thing. Right now I'm in the living room on my cable box on my iPad global controller. What if I do this on an iPhone? Let's bring in a slider here. Well, we have to draw a slider. Let's draw a slider. And let me just get rid of some of this useless feedback. Let's just draw a slider here. Not a toggle button. And now if I tag this volume, watch that functionality automatically populate. So it doesn't matter what source I'm on. And I'll even do it on my Apple TV on my T3X. Let's go here and bring in a slider. Let's look for sliders. Even if it's a horizontal, vertical, it doesn't make a difference. It's going to do the same thing. I'm going to go to my tag window, type in the tag, and because that room macro is so powerful, it will populate the room variable, I should say. Same thing. It'll populate on a room level. So the room level takes that tag, and that tag will do the same thing on all sources in that single room on all the controllers. Okay? So what does that mean? That means if I go into another room, like the office, which has a CX10, and I bring in a slider, and I type in volume here, well, this has a completely different room macro. This one's driving off of zone 4 on the audio distribution unit. So this room has its own room macro because it's a separate room. Okay? But I was able to global macro to this room on this button. So macro levels let you take tags and drive the functionality as far or not as far as you like. Okay? Certain tags, by definition, are probably going to be on the source level. A play button, you don't want to do the same thing on other sources. At least I don't think so. You want your Sonos player to do something different than your cable box, so they're going to have source macros. But you want the confidence that if you make a change to that play command source macro, that change will auto-populate on that source in that room only on every single controller. You don't want to affect another source in another room with that tag name. So that's what the purpose of these macros are, to drive that tag's functionality as far as you like according to this chart. Notice that every macro level except the global macro will stay in that room. Okay? The only macro that will leave a room is a global macro, which does pretty much drives that functionality for that tag everywhere, but it's the lowest priority. Now, if we know that a room macro is all sources in a single room on every controller, then what's a controller macro? Well, it's pretty much the same thing. All sources in that single room, but only that single controller. Let's look at what that means. Let's pretend that we want a room macro that's different on our iPhones in the living room. For example, maybe my iPhone, and we'll just pick any page. I'll just pick my home page for now. Let's pretend my wife and I both have our own favorite DSP. So I'm going to create a DSP button here from my Yamaha. I'm going to call it sound level. No, favorite level. Let's just say favorite level. Okay. And I'm going to program. Let me put this in the middle so it looks normal. Okay. And I'm going to create a macro on this. I'm going to call this tag DSP. Now, if I create a controller macro, this is going to allow me to do, you'll see what this allows me to do different on my other controllers in this room. I could basically take this tag DSP, and by programming a controller macro, I'm basically programming a room macro on it, but it's only going to stay on this controller. So let's go look at our available Yamaha commands for our. Matter of fact, I'll even add some favorite things too here. Let's see. We'll go to our Yamaha, we'll go to our sound programs, and I'll bring in my favorite sound program, which is, let's just say it's, I'll do 9-channel stereo. And maybe I'll throw even a lighting command on here. My favorite lighting scene. But my wife has a completely different favorite DSP and lighting level. Now, if I go to this is my controller, his controller. What if I take this button and I copy this to my wife's controller? So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to select her controller. I'm going to go to her home page, wherever that may be. Here it is. And I'm going to paste it here. Well, that command functionality did not come translating over. So let me type in DSP here. It'll let me create a macro now. So let's create a controller macro now. But I could set my own complete DSP. I'll start with a simple lighting command. Her favorite lighting command is 12. And her favorite DSP is something different. She likes opera. Okay? So now this DSP tag does something different in this room on every controller. I could take this now and copy it to any place on this entire room, as long as it's on the same controller. So if I click on this, I have to click out and then click it. It will reflect my wife's DSP, but my button, which is tagged the same thing in that room, is a completely different DSP. Now, controller macros also are the only macro level that allows you to put something in standalone mode as well. Okay? And that's something that is shown in a separate lesson. But if you want to create a command that goes off of a controller macro, you would create a command. You would create a controller macro level and you would set it to a standalone mode in the drop-down window. And that's covered in a separate window. So controller macros are the only macro level that you could put in standalone mode as well. So let's review this again. A global macro will take a tag and drive its functionality on all sources in all rooms on every single controller. An example of that, of a tag macro, would be, a global macro with a given tag, would be like an arm home tag that would arm the house. Anywhere where you typed in arm home on a button, that functionality would inherit on all sources in all rooms on every controller. The furthest driving macro level and variable level, but the lowest priority. And that is on a variable of that would be a door status or a light level. Okay? Anywhere you put the living room light level feedback element, it would reflect the same living room light level on every single source in every room on every controller. You wouldn't have to keep programming it everywhere. The functionality would carry through. Let's review a source macro and variable. It'll take that tag, that play command, and if I make a change on it, it will affect only that single source in that single room on every controller. Remember my example where we changed the play, stop, and pause Blu-ray commands? Imagine putting a lighting command on 3 of them when you have 10 controllers when you're about to leave the house. Now you have to stay for another half hour searching for all those commands and changing them all and making sure they all populate the same way and then hoping the client doesn't want to make another change to them. So that could be a lot of work. But with a source macro, you drive that tag on that single source in that single room on every controller, and a source variable would correspond to any source as well. A now playing status for an album, now playing album, now playing cover. Maybe a channel feedback. You don't want the channel feedback to show, you want to be able to use a channel feedback if you have 4 cable boxes in one room. You don't want to have a channel feedback different on one versus the other. They're all on different channels. So source macro, a source variable will affect that tag for that single source in that single room on all controllers. A room macro would take it one level up. It'll affect all sources in that single room on every controller. So wherever you put that volume up button, it'll do the same thing on the entire room. You won't have to keep putting in the same command to volume up the Denon receiver or the Yamaha receiver when that volume up tag is really doing the same thing on all sources in that single room on every controller. So that's what a room macro is for. And a controller macro takes it up a notch. A controller macro, well, takes it actually down one little notch. It's a room macro, but it will only take that tag and drive that functionality on that single controller. So you can have a room macro basically different on a iPhone in a living room versus an iPad in a living room. It's also the only macro level that you can put in standalone mode. And it is the highest level priority. Okay? So macros and variables work the same. The level is the same. If you have a global macro and a source macro on a button, the source macro will run. If you have a global source and room, the room will run. If you have a controller macro on a button, no matter what you have on that button, that controller macro will take the highest priority. Okay, those are macro and variable levels. Another thing we'll mention before we close up the webinar is that macro and variable levels and tags are also instrumental in room proxy. So if I go to my iPad on my global controller, well, it is a global controller. If I go in the global area and look on my iPad, you'll notice that when you select one of these zones, Apex, it'll tell Apex what room is selected. What will it do? It will basically take all the tags in that room, let's assume volume, and it will reflect that volume level in whatever room was selected. That's what it will do if you select the living room. This is what will it do if you select the kitchen. This is what it'll do if you select the dining room, and so on, and so on, and so on. So one page, depending on what room you select, the room macros and variables change to that room. So room proxy is a huge benefit or beneficiary of tags and macro levels. And in turn, when we come out with source proxy, that will also be contingent on tags and macro levels. So macro levels and tags, take getting used to, but huge in Apex. Drive changes as far as you like, anytime you want, easily. No more making changes on buttons and searching for them everywhere you made the change. It's easy to do in Apex. Before we close out, one more thing. If you go to the Edit and Edit Tags section, or Edit Tags option in the toolbar, you're going to see a list of all the tags in Apex. This is the only place where you can rename a tag or delete a tag. Erasing it from this window will not get rid of it. So if I click on a button, it'll show me everywhere, and I'll just expand this so you can see it. It'll show me everywhere where that tag exists in that entire interface. It'll show you the controller, the room, the source it exists on, and the actual page name. So you can modify, delete. Just be careful when you delete a tag, you're deleting the functionality. And that's another good point I want to show you. So right now, the tag Vincent, which is my name, doesn't exist in Apex, right? And let's prove that. I'm going to go to my edit tags, and these are in alphabetical order. I'm going to go try to find Vincent. Okay, here are all the V's. I don't see Vincent. It's not here. So when does Vincent actually exist? as soon as it lands on a button or anywhere in Apex. So I'm going to go here, and I'm just going to create a little text box button. And as soon as I tag this Vincent, this tag now, let's go look and see if this tag exists. Here it is. This tag exists on my RTI panel. So tag doesn't exist until it physically lands on a button. So what if I create a command on my Vincent? It doesn't matter which level. I just want to show you how relationships don't get deleted if you delete the button. But let's go, and I'll just put an Apple TV command here that says goes to menu on my Vincent button, and we'll call this menu. So now this tag exists, Vincent. Let's go look at our tag window just to show everybody again. Here's my Vincent tag. It exists on my RTI panel. Now what happens when I delete Vincent, where I created a source macro on? Now, if I go look at my tags, you'll see that Vincent still exists, but it's not on a button. So once you create a tag on Apex, even though it doesn't appear on any interface, it's still part of Apex. And even better, when you put it on a button, depending on what source it's on, what source level it's on. So let's create a completely different button here. As long as I tag this Vincent, the relationship is still here to that menu main function. So relationships don't go away, okay? Just because you've created a tag, mapped the tag to it, and then you deleted the button it was on. However, if you go to the edit tags list and you delete Vincent tag or rename it, it'll give you a warning that says any macros, variables, or page links associated with this tag will also be deleted. Are you sure? Let me click yes. And now this Vincent will, even if I retag this Vincent, it will not populate the source macro. So the lesson is that tags will maintain the relationship even if you decide not to show them after you've created it. It'll always exist for you. You don't have to be conscious of keeping it around, so to speak. So that is macro and variable levels and tags in Apex. Obviously a quick version. Please refer to RTI Excel, and please polish your craft by going over this again and playing around like I've shown you. It's a great resource. So to summarize, a global macro will take that tag's functionality and drive it to all sources in all rooms on all controllers. A source macro will take that tag's functionality and drive it to that single source in that single room on every controller. Most common macro level and typical of a play command or a pause command or a now playing variable. A room macro will drive that tag's functionality to all sources in that room on every controller. A volume up, down, mute, or the volume feedback, or the DSP feedback in that room. Doesn't matter what source it's on, that tag will do the same thing in that room. And a controller macro is a room macro, but you can distinguish a single controller from all controllers. So you can copy that tag to all sources in that single room, but your iPad in that room can do something different than your iPhone or your other controllers. In fact, every controller can have a room macro that does something different in that room. Not really used much, but if you have a standalone command, or if you want to distinguish that tag on a controller, you can make a controller macro, which will, or what you can also do is by making a controller macro on a macro that you want in a room that for this, if there's two controllers in a room and they both have room macros, but you want that controller macro to do something different, another controller to do something different, just create a controller macro on that button. It'll bypass the room macro, but just for that controller. You'll find the need to do that. And just remember, the highest priority is the controller macro, and the lowest priority is the global macro. And you'll find that out because you'll see when you run commands what gets ignored and what runs. All right, well, thanks for joining us. Sorry we went a little over time. This is an important subject and one of the main driving features of Apex. Thanks for coming, and we appreciate it. We'll see you next week.